Hey, y'all, I'm Bud Elliott, and this is my college football summer school series on Cover 3. I bring on the team experts from the 24/7 sports staff and ask them the questions I care about. No fluff. Which players will be toughest to replace? What position groups are sneakily better or worse than I realize? We get you the scoop on each team in 20 minutes or less. Let's go. Hey, guys, welcome back. It's Summer School College Football Cover 3 podcast. I'm Bud Elliott. That's Nathan King, and that means we're going to talk Auburn today. He's from Auburn Undercover, does a great job covering Auburn. Nathan, welcome back to the show, man.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this since last year.
A little more positive vibes, I think, in this year than we had last year. We call these team sites, not fan sites, because our analysts are actually honest and don't just spew nonsense to their people. And Nathan was a little down on that team last year as it entered the season and was proven correct. 5-7, the worst Auburn team, I think, since 2012. I'm going to hit you with just kind of an overarching question here so we can set a baseline for what that roster was last year. I'm not really sure everybody on that team was fully bought into what Brian Harsin was selling the entire season.
Yep.
If Hugh Freeze and his staff had coached last year's roster against last year's schedule, are they a win better? Are they 2 wins better? What do you think?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I've actually been posed that one before. I'm trying to think about games that were lost strictly because of coaching. And I think for most of those, you'd have to go back to 2021. When you're looking at all of the blown leads, they were up 25 at home to Miss State. They're like one play away from winning the Iron Bowl with a one-legged quarterback. That was all coaching. I mean, all of that were decisions that were made in the game. Last year was just their roster was completely depleted. Your third-year starting quarterback was gone. Robbie Ashford did a lot of fun things at quarterback, but you felt like it was a square hole round peg kind of thing. Like they weren't adapting to him very well. I think maybe your answer comes looking at what Cadillac Williams did. Like they just went to this team's strengths on offense and they put up the most rushing yards on Alabama ever under Nick Saban. So yeah, maybe 1 win, 1 or 2. I think you're definitely looking at a bowl game under Hugh Freeze last year, but I mean, the biggest issue, I think, was what happened with the roster. And, of course, that was on the coaches as well. But they put themselves in a really bad spot, particularly on offense, to where, look, if Tank Bigsby wasn't working, there was pretty much nothing else. It was their least efficient season of quarterback play in 20 years. And so, maybe one more win, which isn't very exciting. But I think you saw that at the end of the year with Cadillac and that staff sort of saying, hey, we're not going to complicate things. We know what we got. Let's just roll with it.
Last year, you mentioned the offense was troublesome at times, outside the top 50 nationally, which is not normal for Auburn. Obviously, Hugh Freeze generally knows how to score points in most leagues and most of the teams he's coached for. Ashford returns 36% success rate passing the ball last year is not the worst that we've seen so far in the series, but it is not close to the top. Peyton Thorne comes in from Michigan State. His numbers were pretty awful as well at Michigan State, at least last year. What do you have a feel for who's likely to be the starter here, or is it a split time situation? What's your read on the QB room?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, they had to get a quarterback because, like we were just saying, the inefficiency last year, and TJ Finley is out the door, but he didn't do much to necessarily contribute to that positively. Robbie Ashford dealt with a lot of injuries. He had to do a lot all by himself, pretty much head to toe. He was dealing with stuff by the end of the year. But like you talked about, the numbers weren't great for him. 7 touchdowns, 7 picks, 49% is the lowest completion percentage by an Auburn starting quarterback since 1998. And a lot of the stuff was not deep balls. It was stuff near the line of scrimmage that was just kind of generally and fundamentally inaccurate from him. And so, they were pursuing transfers hard in the first window. They kicked the tires on, not even kicked the tires. They wanted Grayson McCall to come visit the academics. Didn't really work out there. Devin Leary did visit. He was a silent commit to Kentucky already. They kicked the tires on Spencer Sanders. And so, for lack of a better phrase, they sort of struck out on these quarterbacks. And especially after Finley left, you're looking at Robbie Ashford, who, again, is an exciting player, and I'm interested to see how he develops. And you're looking at a redshirt freshman in Holden Gariner. And you have to do something with that room if you're going to end up being competitive early in the Hugh Freeze era. And so while Peyton Thorne is not necessarily the biggest splash at quarterback in the world, 25 starts at the Power 5 level, 49 career touchdown passes. That's 7 times what they had in the room already under Robbie Ashford. So just from an experience standpoint alone, I think he's a pretty decent upgrade. I just think you look at his numbers, again, not necessarily spectacular last year. In 2021, Obviously, everybody was pretty good on that Michigan State team that year, but he did break Kirk Cousins' single season record. He was one of the best deep ball passers in the country that year. And so I think there's a lot with somebody like Hugh Freeze, who's had quarterback success. Philip Montgomery, he's had a lot of quarterback success in his tenure. And so there's a lot to work with there. Long story short, in terms of who's going to be the starter at this juncture, as we're recording here in May, I have a difficult time not saying Peyton Thorne, just because you look what he accomplished at the Power 5 level. He was a pretty decent quarterback. He wasn't great, but he was decent. And so, when you're talking about the lows that Auburn's offense reached last year, the lows that this passing game reached, which offensive line was dreadful, didn't really have anybody consistent at receiver. So let's make sure all those, all that proper context is there as well. I still think you got to give the nod at this point to a guy who's got 25, 26 starts in his career and has a lot more experience at the Power 5 level. But while he is a lot more polished of a passer and he is a lot more of a veteran, has a lot of experience, Robbie Ashford can do things that he can't. And if that ends up being a key in this offense, if this offensive line doesn't improve and whoever the quarterback is kind of has to run for his life for what feels like the 5th straight season at Auburn, then maybe Robbie Ashford will have a little bit of advantage. Where I come back to, though, this does feel like an improved O-line. The 3 transfers they brought in before spring ball all lined up with starting jobs, all look like they're going to be improved versus what they had last season. And as I'm sure we're going to get into, they've got some receiving talent now from the transfer portal. And so I think all of that kind of sets the table for Peyton Thorne to be the starter, but he's got to go out and win it in the fall. It's been a long time since an Auburn quarterback has shown up after spring practice and won the job. A quarterback hasn't won the job in fall camp that hasn't been there in the spring since Nick Marshall all the way back in 2013. So it's a bit of an uphill hike, especially with a brand new coaching staff, but I think I would still give the nod to Thorne at this point.
Marshall in 2013, of course, did work out pretty well. Yeah, I didn't mean that just kind of rhetorically as far as Thorne Ashford. I thought back, okay, Malik Willis worked pretty well with Hugh Freeze at Liberty. Turns out like Malik Willis can't read a defense to save his life once he got to the NFL, and he was a good athlete like Ashford is. So maybe Hugh Freeze can work some magic there with the mobile quarterback. And I mean, I'm sort of in like prove it to me mode on Thorne because he had a 2nd round receiver in Reed, and he had the number 1 receiver in the transfer portal in Keon Coleman to throw to. And his numbers were still really pretty bad. But then again, like he also didn't have Walker like he had in 2021, who ended up being a total beast for the Seahawks. I'm curious about this Auburn receiving core because in my notes that I put together about a week ago, they say this receiving core still sucks, right? But then Auburn has picked up some recent transfers that I think are pretty interesting. Have your thoughts on this room changed?
Yeah, they have, and they've really changed in the last week or so. We knew they were going to go hard in the portal. I'm not sure 4 transfer receivers is necessarily what I thought they would do, but they've really hit that position well. Credit to first-year coach Marcus Davis, a guy who was kind of a young riser in the coaching industry. He was part of that great Georgia Southern offense last year. He comes back to his alma mater at Auburn. Yeah, you talk about the guys they picked up over the past couple weeks. So, going back to before spring, they picked up Nick Mardner, sort of a big-bodied guy. It's definitely an outside receiver. He played under Marcus Davis at Hawaii. And then Caleb Burton, he's a name that some recruiting junkies might remember, former top 150 player. Didn't play at all at Ohio State his freshman year, but I mean, I think it's pretty clear if you are signed to play receiver at Ohio State and they think you're good enough to come there, you've usually got something good going on. And so I think he's kind of like a retroactive freshman for them that they can just kind of build in the future. But yeah, over the past week, they get Jair Shorter from North Texas, a guy who caught 11 touchdowns last year. He only caught 23 passes all season, and almost half of them were touchdowns. Definitely a Midas touch kind of guy. They suffered from inaccurate quarterback play. Looking at North Texas, that their numbers were kind of similar to that of Robbie Ashford in terms of completion percentage. And so, but when the ball was in the area, he's kind of the definition of a deep threat. He's had some injuries throughout his career, but Auburn doesn't have anybody like that. They don't have anybody that they can line up on the outside and just tell them to just go and kind of stretch the defense. And so I think that filled a big need. And then Shane Hooks has kind of been the highlight guy for them the past couple of days. They picked him up on, well, I guess that doesn't really matter based on when this is posted. But they pick him up toward the end of May. Jackson State transfer. He was Jackson State's leading receiver in every category last year. And I talked to Auburn's OC, Philip Montgomery, about him this week. And the vibe I got was that they think he can just kind of do a little bit of everything. He's got the length to go on the outside. He's 6'4". He's got a lot of speed, so he can burn the defense. And then he said he has 11-inch hands. And the NFL Combine record is 11.75. So, he wears 4 XL gloves, and he's a wide receiver. And so they're hoping that catch radius will pay off. So, I mean, at the end of the day, just like all transfers at every position, these guys are going to have to prove it. And you mentioned Peyton Thorne has had some, parts of his career where he hasn't been the most accurate. Again, the O-line has to work as well. But based on what these guys had coming back at receiver, which was a few exciting pieces here and there, but nobody that you're really like, that's the guy. That's the number one receiver. There was nobody like that. I think there was a bunch of third and fourth receivers for this team coming from last year. Now you have a couple guys, maybe that can take that next step to kind of become the alpha of the passing game. I think you have a couple more options than you did even before, even after spring practice ended.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've done a really nice job with that room. I'm also, and maybe I'm wrong on this. I hope I'm not. I'm really high on what they did with the offensive line transfers. We if you guys watch Cover 3 at home, I bet the heck out of the AAC last year, and Tulsa was a weird roster, like a lot of just meh, but then a couple dudes who could really, really play, and a couple of NFL camps now, and now you got Auburn took both their tackles, and I thought both those guys were pretty darn good. And when they were out, when they got hurt last year for Tulsa went off a cliff. So they definitely seemed to matter a lot. How have they looked so far at Auburn?
Yeah, we mentioned it earlier. The three guys that they had in the spring, it was seamless. I mean, they were right in there. You thought Dylan Wade, he comes over from Tulsa. You thought he was going to be your left tackle, slotted in there almost immediately. He was a guy, you mentioned them being good at Tulsa last year. And of course, they have the connection with Philip Montgomery. He was the head coach at Tulsa. Now he's Auburn's OC. So obviously, they know him really well and have a good relationship with him. When he was in the transfer portal, LSU, USC, Alabama, Georgia, they were all after this guy. So in terms of, offensive line evaluations, that's a pretty good place to start when you're looking at offer sheets. Avery Jones, you mentioned the American Conference. Avery Jones comes over from East Carolina. He's a guy who is the number one rated player for them in the transfer portal. Like he's the top rated addition by 24/7 Sports. You look at his pass protection over the past few years at Pro Football Focus, one of the best players in the entire country, regardless Group of Five, regardless Power Five, in terms of protecting the quarterback. And their right tackle is Gunnar Britton. He played at Western Kentucky. Just a mammoth, like 6'6", 340 pounds, 330 pounds. He was also one of the better pass protectors. I believe he was fifth nationally in the Group of Five in terms of quarterback pressures allowed at the Group of Five level among tackles. And so, and then the second portal window, like you mentioned, they get the other tackle. They get Jaden Muskrat. Great name, by the way. He was Tulsa's starting right tackle last year. He's a guy that, from talking to Freeze and from talking to Montgomery, he'll be a guard. Like, they don't have a need at tackle right now, and their guards have not performed very well the past couple of years. They got Jeremiah Wright at left guard. He's kind of a mauler. I think he'll stick there. But you need a guy at right guard. Muskrat has a lot of tools. He was pretty good last year. Right tackle, not incredible, but you still needed a guy like that can come in, if nothing else, kind of give you that too deep. And so, look, I've been telling people, if Muskrat starts, because those other three guys are going to start, if he ends up starting, you're talking 4 or 5 offensive linemen are going to be transfers, and they're going to be brand new guys. That is best case scenario. As much as you can wipe this slate, that's going to be the best thing for this offensive line. They've not had an offensive lineman drafted since 2018. That's pretty much the last time, because that was coming off the SEC West championship team. That's pretty much the last time they had any sort of consistency. I mean, look what Bo Nix did when he got to Oregon, and he had one of the best offensive lines in the country. I'm not saying that's an apples to apples situation, but their quarterbacks have really not benefited at all, and their run games have been really shaky. Guys like Tank Bigsby have had games where they look really bad because of the run blocking. So that, to me, might be, looking at the entire roster top down, that position might be the biggest reason why I'm saying, okay, maybe Auburn can end up, winning 6 or 7 games this year after such a bad roster last season because of what they've done on the O-line. If those guys don't produce, though, I think they might be in a rough spot on offense. But right now they've all settled in really well, and I think at least 3 of them are going to be starters up front.
You mentioned the running back room. Bigsby's gone. As of this recording, the afternoon of May 23rd, Jarquez Hunter is just, I saw this on Twitter. I hope it's not a deep pick. Is he suspended by the university or
no? So not officially at the moment. Very murky situation. Something we don't have a lot of details on at the moment. There was a kind of a social media allegation situation with him that we're not going to get too deep into details on, but it does involve the Auburn's starting running back Jarquez Hunter. But some other people have been kind of putting out there that, oh, he's suspended and multiple student athletes are suspended. You can kind of take that away maybe from the university statement, but at the same time, that's a little bit presumptuous. Like, we don't know all the facts, and I think that's irresponsible to assume that at this point. So like you said, at the moment of recording right now, absolutely, yeah, he's their number one running back, and no action has been taken yet. But we'll kind of get details. I would imagine in the next few weeks are gonna come out on that, and Auburn will hopefully, because the football program hasn't said anything, hasn't made any statements on it yet. So spring meetings are coming up. Maybe some clarity from Hugh Freeze there.
Gotcha. So on the other side of the ball, Auburn for really the last decade had been an elite level defense. I think the worst finish they'd had in over the last 7 or 8 years was like 15th, 16th, if you adjust for opponent. Last year, Bill Connolly had him at 67th, and it just they dropped off a cliff. I'm guessing some combination of recruiting finally caught up with them, plus also buy into the coaching staff. They were still a great tackling team, which was interesting. Got guys on the ground pretty well. What are they going to run defensively? Has Hugh Freeze talked about that at all?
Yeah, so Ron Roberts comes in from Baylor, and you're exactly right. By the way, sort of an unspoken, or I guess maybe underappreciated aspect of Auburn for the better part of the last decade has been Kevin Steele was fantastic as defensive coordinator. They never finished outside the top 20 in SP plus defense. Under him, tons of draft picks. Derek Mason comes in. They don't really have that big of a drop off under him. And then Jeff Schmedding, the defensive coordinator last year, they set the program record for most games allowed, allowing 40 points on defense in program history in any season. So yeah, wasn't necessarily their best stuff last year, and that was a big part of their downfall. They just couldn't keep people off the scoreboard. Yeah, Ron Roberts comes in from Baylor. He was a guy that when he was on the market this offseason, because he was maybe scapegoat is the wrong word for him and Dave Aranda there at Baylor, but they had that great season in 2021, one of the best defenses in the country. And then when he was available this offseason, you saw like Arkansas felt like they were pretty close to landing him, and Auburn ends up bringing him in. Really, obviously, veteran defensive coach. He's got a great coaching tree that includes Pete Golding, and so it is going to be base 3-4. They're relying a lot on that defensive end spot, guys who can kind of be versatile at that position. The star position, where Auburn's got a couple interesting names on defense, is going to be super important. You look at his past defenses; that's been sort of a big calling card for them. But really, regardless of what they were going to run this season, the secondary was going to be their strength, no doubt. After last season, they've only lost one guy to the transfer portal. He didn't even play in a game. But so still, they're bringing back all 11 players that played in a game last season in the secondary. Like everybody who contributed is back on this defense. You didn't have any second level guys enter the transfer portal or anything like that. And so it's an absolutely loaded defensive back room. Safety is really, really good. They moved over a guy who was a corner to safety, and he absolutely flourished at the end of last year. They had two guys who could have been draft picks, DJ James, Nehemiah Pritchett. They ended up coming back and playing another year, and so they'll be draft picks next year. And so I think that is absolutely the strength of this entire team, because if you start breaking down the defensive line depth and you start breaking down what they got at linebacker, where they lose Owen Papo, it's not overly encouraging. It's not bad. They have definitely worked the portal really well for the front seven. But in terms of proven production, there's not a ton going on. It's like the receiving core, a bunch of interesting names and a bunch of talent they brought in. But in terms of proven production, there's not a lot of meat on the bone there right now. So they'll definitely, Ron Roberts and that defense definitely will be relying on the secondary this year.
I'm really glad you said that. I look at what they did last year in the defensive secondary, and I have a hard time judging just how good they are because teams were so successful, despite Auburn's good tackling success rate. Their getting off block success rate was not good last year. So like they got guys on the ground once they got to them, but they were easily blocked. And so teams, for the most part, did not pass the ball all that often on Auburn last year. Like they were really run on quite a bit. So I wasn't sure, like, are they avoiding these corners because they're good, or it's just because it's just easier to and kind of safer to run the ball if you know that you can go on the ground? I mean, that's pretty encouraging for them. My guess is that they will need those guys to play in a lot of one-on-one situations since they do lose an awful lot at linebacker and just throughout the front seven, and will probably have the need to blitz.
Yeah, and Ron Roberts does a lot of creative blitzes, as any defensive coordinator does, of course. But I'm glad you're bringing up the one-on-one battles on the outside. That's something that you look at his defenses in the past. We talked about the star position being important. That's somebody who's going to need to lock up a guy in the slot, and you're pretty much on an island. If he's able to get past you there in the middle, they want DJ James and Nehemiah Pritchett to go one-on-one. Jalen Simpson was the guy I mentioned who's moved back to safety. He really looked like a good player at the end of last year. And Zach Etheridge said in spring practice, we think he's a Sunday guy if he can keep developing there. At safety, they've got a couple levels of depth there in the secondary. Like you said, this was one of their worst run defenses in the modern era. Last year, that's how teams were able to just jump all over them. I think Arkansas had like 230 rushing yards by the second quarter against this defense. And so, like you said, there was really not a lot of need by the end of games to start throwing on them. And so I think it's most apparent, the way that they feel about this secondary is that they've hit the portal hard. Number 2 transfer class in the country, 20 transfers as of recording right now. They didn't feel the need to get anybody in the secondary. They kicked the tires on a few players, had a few players come in on visits, but they haven't felt the need to really press down the gas and say, oh, we need a guy to fill a spot at corner. We need another safety. They feel really confident with the guys they've got right now, and they've got even more guys coming in as summer enrollees.
So along that defensive line, they get Justin Rogers from Kentucky. We don't really talk about him a whole lot. Like, guys, if you watch in Kentucky, you watch the SEC, he's a damn good football player. Among the other transfers, or I guess the few remaining guys on the roster, who's a player that they either need to step up or you really expect to step up to play alongside Rogers on that D line?
Yeah, Marcus Harris is probably a name that's going to pop up a little bit more this year. He's been a starter the past 2 years, but Colby Wooden was just so good alongside him that sort of, garnered most of the attention. Derek Hall was one of the better pass rushers in the SEC over the past couple of years, so he got a lot of attention there as well. But Harris is going to need to be a good player. Like you mentioned, they're kind of counting on Justin Rogers to be that people eater there in the middle at nose tackle, where he was so good at Kentucky last year. They brought in a couple more transfers. Mosiah Nasili Kite comes over from Maryland, a guy who can play a little bit of both, kind of play that defensive end spot, can kick inside. There was a lot of good things said about him in spring practice. Lawrence Johnson comes over from Purdue, maybe more of a depth guy at the moment. But in terms of guys that need to step up, like you said, somebody at the edge rusher position. It's now called their jack linebacker spot, with Dylan Brooks entering the transfer portal, former top 100 recruit. Didn't really do anything at Auburn, but has a lot of talent. With him in the portal, they don't have any returning production at that position. Ekuliota's gone to the NFL. Derek Hall's gone to the NFL. In terms of guys they're bringing back, or in terms of guys they brought on the roster, they got a Vanderbilt transfer, a guy who hasn't had a sack since 2019. They got an App State transfer in the second portal window, 7.5 tackles for loss last year. Good player. But again, if you're banking your entire position group on a group of 5 transfer, you're probably not in the best spot. And so I point to a guy like Keldrick Falk, which you as somebody who covers Florida State on a consistent basis, but you know who Keldrick Falk is. And you know how good of a player he is. It was apparent like in the second week of spring practice. His teammates would just come talk to us and they were like, yeah, that guy's a dude. Like he's got it already. And so of course, you don't want to put that kind of pressure on a freshman, but when a guy's 6'5", 275 pounds that can move the way that he does, I think that jack defensive end, pass rusher, whatever you want to call it, in Ron Roberts' defense, I think they would be best served if he ends up being their best player by the end of the year. And again, you look at the room around him, there's some experience, there's some transfers, talent, there's nobody that even touches him from a pass rushing position. And so that's one guy where maybe I would say, hey, keep an eye on him from week 1 to week 13, see how he progresses, because I think he's got a chance to be one of the best freshmen in the SEC next year.
What I'm hearing is there's going to need to blitz a whole lot if Auburn has leads to hold some of these leads. Because, Arkansas last year, who they go play November 11th, had the number 1 rated PFF line in the SEC, and Bama, Ole Miss, LSU, Georgia are all on the schedule, as well as A&M, which it'd be hard for A&M to have a worse offensive line than it did last year. I guess things can happen. Yeah, that's going to be very, very interesting to follow. Nathan, where would you say is the biggest drop-off between the starters and the backups on this roster? When you're out at practice, you're like, oh boy, the backups, not that we're saying they can't play someday, but if they had to play this year a lot, they're in real trouble.
It's a great question. That's a really good question. I fear for Auburn, it might be the defensive line. You look at that top group, and they lost a couple guys in the transfer portal. I wouldn't have said this if they didn't lose Jeffrey Embaugh, who was kind of an exciting player at defensive end. He ends up going to Purdue, former number 1 JUCO defensive lineman in the country a couple years ago. Because I feel pretty good about Justin Rogers. I feel pretty good about Marcus Harris. He's got experience now. And then whoever ends up being their best pass rusher, I feel pretty good about them as well. Other than that, it's just kind of rotational pieces from the past couple years, guys who haven't proven that much. Again, they do get a couple Power 5 transfers in from Maryland and from Purdue, but you're not necessarily wanting to bank on those. You're hoping that you have a little bit more depth heading into the year. I was going to say linebacker, but I think linebacker might be more of a situation where the entire outlook is just kind of murky. Like I think 1 through from the opposite end, to answer a question you didn't even ask, From the opposite end, I think the room that is probably closest 1 through 6, closest 1 through 7 is linebacker. Like they've got a couple guys that I think could be the starters, and the guys who are maybe 5th or 6th right now, I don't think are that far off. And so that's going to be an interesting competition. But yeah, maybe not the best sign again that I've named off the entire front 7 there for Auburn. And again, it goes back to why this secondary is going to be so important for them this season.
100%. So Chapman's back at punter, right? Was a top 5 punter last year and had to punt an awful lot. 57 punts is quite a few punts for a team that did not make a bowl game. What happened last year on kickoff coverage? They were a bottom 10 unit in the country in kickoffs. Like Anders Carlson was around forever. Did he get hurt or something? Because it's weird to see 20% of opponent kickoff or of kickoffs returned outside the 30.
Anders Carlson had a season-ending injury in each of the past 2 years.
Okay, there you go.
And that's why it was a little bit surprising, honestly, for us that he got drafted in the 6th round. But you know, he's got great power, and I think his brother's last name I think has definitely helped him out a lot in terms of looking at him and saying, hey, we can make him an NFL kicker. There's something that Brian Harsin always kind of skirted around. We would ask him, why is the kickoff coverage so bad? And he said, I don't really have an answer for that. Like, well, that's not necessarily the best sign. But yeah, Carlson didn't have the same power that he used to. You go back to like 2019, he was much more consistent in that category. And then, you know, when you blow up a coaching staff and when you fire the head coach, it's usually because a lot of things aren't working. And special teams coverage was definitely among those. You're talking about punting, though. That's a positive. That has been a positive for Auburn over the past few years. And like you said, it's kind of had to be because of how bad their offense has been. It's kind of shocking to me that Oscar Chapman is still here at Auburn. He's actually technically only a senior right now. So he's honestly in a position where he's trying to become an NFL punter. Like he's trying to be one of those 4 or 5 guys that either get drafted or have an opportunity to go as undrafted guys in camps. And so he's definitely got a chance to do that. PFF has loved his numbers over the past few years. And so when you mix that with Brian Battie is a USF transfer, he's going to be their kick returner. He was the first team All-American kick returner in 2021. He was the best kick returner in the country.
He's shifty, dude.
He had 3 kick return touchdowns. He also had 1,000 yards on the ground last year. And so I think he's one of the more valuable transfer pickups. So when you kind of splice those two things together, they've got Alex McPherson, by the way, as their kicker right now. That last name, yes, is the McPherson last name from the NFL lineage there. And so he was the number 1 kicker in the country. Auburn obviously loves to do that. He looked dynamite at the end of last year after Carlson got hurt. And so, special teams isn't something that's brought up a ton when you're looking at a new staff. And so I'm glad you did, because I think that's actually has a chance to be, maybe you talk about free yardage, talk about, opportunities. What's the difference between 6 and 7 wins? Maybe it's a few plays here on special teams. I definitely think they've got the personnel to do that.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we don't talk a lot of special teams on Summer School. We just got done talking to Chris Fetters, who runs Dogman at Washington. And just some of the numbers on my spreadsheet stick out. Like Washington only punted 23 times last year. Auburn punted 57. Their punter at Washington is horrendous, but it doesn't really matter that much because they punt less than twice a game. So, it kind of sticks out that the gap between punting and kickoff, when you would assume a lot of the same guys would be on the coverage teams, was that drastic. I appreciate you clearing that up. Man, I really appreciate the time. This has been so much fun, and everybody needs to check out Auburn Undercover, also the Auburn Undercover podcast. Great time over there. Nathan, I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Appreciate y'all.